My goodness. I haven't been in a schoolhouse in 132 years. And never before in this one. But I'm sure glad to be here this afternoon. It's nice to see a full house. Too bad it's not the Opera House. I need my cheaters. A lot of pictures are taken of me without my cheaters. But if you look at the photographs carefully, they're down here in my hand, kind of low, hanging over the chair. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. It feels really strange to be back in Reed's Landing after 132 years. I was here in 1881, and you had just suffered the loss of your town at about that time to the railroad barons that came through and changed everything. The boarding houses, the bars, the hotels, all gone. So when our boat came by, there was nothing here to stop and look at. It was 1881. There was nothing here to see. I understand the post office has also been closed. I'm sad to hear that, because I had a problem with the mail. I got these letters that got mixed up somehow in the mail system, and these are all for Hal Holbrook. I didn't open them because, well, I just didn't, but they seem to be all of a laudatory nature. Yes, they are. They're all laudatory nature. They were good. They were good. Here's an excerpt from the book that I wrote, Life on the Mississippi. And it has to do with this particular stretch of the river, and that's why I copied it down for this occasion. We were coming up the river, getting material for this very book. Then the river widens, and a most charming and magnificent view of the valley before us suddenly bursts upon our vision. Rugged hills, clad with verdant forests from summit to base, level prairie lands holding in their lap the beautiful Wabasha, city of healing waters, puissant foe of Bright's disease. I should explain, Bright's disease was a liver ailment, and the water around here was supposed to cure that. The grandest conception of nature's work, incomparable Lake Pepin. These constitute a picture whereon the tourist's eye may gaze for uncounted hours, with rapture unappeased and unappeasable. To the right, Maiden's Rock, home of the late departed Winona, darling of Indian song and story, which may be the most pathetic of all the legends of the Mississippi. I heard the story told as follows. A little distance above Lake City is a famous point known as Maiden's Rock, which is not only a picturesque spot, but it is full of romantic interest from the event that gave it its name. Not many years ago, this locality was a favorite resort for the Sioux Indians on account of the fine fishing and hunting to be had there. And large numbers of them were always to be found in this area. Among the families which used the resort here was one belonging to the tribe of Wabasha or Wapasha. Winona, which means firstborn, was the name of a maiden who had plighted her troth to a lover belonging to the same band. Her stern parents had promised her hand to another, a famous warrior, and insisted on her marrying him. The day was fixed by her parents, to her great grief. She appeared to accede to the proposal and accompanied them to the rock for the purpose of gathering flowers for the feast. On reaching the rock, Winona ran up to the summit, and standing on its edge, she upbraided her parents who were below for their cruelty. And then, singing a death dirge, she hurled herself over the edge from the precipice and dashed them to pieces on the rock below. She was a good deal jarred up and jolted, but she got herself together and disappeared before the coroner reached the fatal spot. And it is said that she sought and married her true love and wandered with him to some distant clime where she lived happily ever after. Her gentle spirit mellowed and chastened by the romantic incident which had so early deprived her of the sweet guidance of a mother's love and a father's protective arm, and thrown her, all unfriended, upon the cold charity of a censorious world. Well, that's what I wrote when I was here in 1881. I was born in Florida, Missouri on November 30th, 1835. My father was a justice of the peace, and I supposed that he posed the power of life and death over all men and could hang anybody who offended him. This was distinction enough for me as a general thing, but the desire to be a steamboatman kept intruding, particularly after we moved to Hannibal, right on the Mississippi River, when I was just a boy. I was 4. Before I was 13, I had been extracted 3 times from that river and 6 times from Bear Creek in a substantially drowned condition. But my mother, with high confidence in my future, never deserted me. She merely shrugged and said, "People who are born to be hanged are safe in the water." Every boy in Hannibal dreamed of working on the river. First, I wanted to be a cabin boy so that I could come out with a white apron and shake a tablecloth over the edge where all my old comrades could see me. And later I thought it'd be okay to be a deckhand, the one that stood at the end of the stage plank with that coil of rope in his hand, because he was also conspicuous. But these were only daydreams. They were too heavenly to be contemplated as real possibilities. But then, one of our boys went away and was not heard from for a long time. And then he turned up as an apprentice engineer on a steamboat. This thing shook all the bottoms out of all my Sunday school teachings. That boy had been notoriously worldly, and I, just the reverse. He was exalted to this eminence, and I, left in obscurity and misery. And there was nothing generous about this fellow. And whenever his boat was laid up for a couple of days, he'd come home and he'd swell around the town in his blackest, greasiest clothes so that nobody could help remembering that he was a steamboatman. He would speak of the larboard side of a horse in an easy, natural way that would make you wish he was dead. And he was always talking about St. Louis like he was an old citizen. He'd casually mention coming down 4th Street, or when he was passing by the planter's house, or when there was a fire and he took a turn on the brakes of the big old Missouri. He had money too, and hair oil, and a silver watch with a showy brass chain. He wore a leather belt with no suspenders. If ever a youth was cordially admired and hated by his comrades, this one was. And no girl could withstand his charms. He cut out every boy in the village. He was cordially admired and hated by his comrades. When his boat finally blew up, it brought a contentment that we had not known for months. But when he came home the next week, alive, renowned, and appeared in church all battered up and bandaged, a shining hero, stared at and wondered over by everybody. It seemed to us that the partiality of Providence for an undeserving reptile had reached a point where it was open to criticism. Now, a riverboat pilot in those days of trivial wages had a princely salary, $150 to $250 a month, and no board to pay. 2 months of his pay would be a yearly salary for a preacher. It was precisely equal to that of the Vice President of the United States of America or to a Supreme Court judge. True. Now, some of us were left inconsolate. We could not get on the river. At least our parents wouldn't let us. I'd been setting type for my brother Orion's newspaper in Hannibal. The salary was decent, except for the fact that it was never paid. Food, but no money. So by and by, I ran away, with only dreams of a future when I would be a great and honored pilot. I went east and wandered from one printing office to another setting type. It was a dirty job, and few people wanted it. I saw the World's Fair in New York, and I lived in St. Louis, and Muscatine, and Keokuk. The hope within me to be a pilot struggled to a reluctant death, and I found myself without an ambition. But I was ashamed to go home. I'd been reading about the recent exploration of the Amazon River. A government expedition needed more information about the headwaters of that river, which was 4,000 miles from its mouth. I was in Cincinnati, about 1,500 miles from New Orleans, where I could no doubt get a ship. I had $30. I would go and complete the exploration of the Amazon. That was all I thought. That's all I thought about. I never was great in the matters of details. I packed my valise, took passage on an ancient tub called the Paul Jones to New Orleans for the sum of $16. I was a traveler. A word had never tasted so good in my mouth before. One of the pilots on that boat was Horace Bixby. And little by little, I got acquainted with him. And pretty soon I was doing a lot of steering for him during the daylight watches. And when I got to New Orleans, I inquired about ships leaving for Para, Brazil. I discovered that there weren't any. And probably wouldn't be any in that century. It had not occurred to me to inquire about these particulars before leaving Cincinnati. So there I was. I couldn't get to the Amazon. I had no friends in New Orleans, and no money to speak of. I went to Horace Bixby, and I asked him to make a pilot out of me. He said he would, for $100, cash in advance. So I steered with him up to St. Louis, borrowed the money from my brother-in-law, and closed the bargain. I had acquired this brother-in-law several years before. Within 18 months, I became a competent pilot and was earning $250 a month. Meantime, my brother, Orion, was rapidly losing money in a little job printing office in Keokuk, living with his wife's family. He also offered his services as a lawyer, but he never got a case, nor even an applicant for a case. He moved to a little hamlet called Alexandria, 2 or 3 miles downriver. He had run hard aground. I supported him thenceforth until 1861. 1861. The Civil War brought a halt to all steamboat travel below St. Louis. One cannonball could easily sink any of those wooden ships. My steamboating days were over. I look back at those days with both joy and sadness. Joy at my accomplishment of learning to navigate that twisting, turning, changing river, and sadness about the loss of my younger brother, Henry. He died in May of 1858 as a result of the boilers blowing up on the Pennsylvania, a steamer that I had helped him get a job on. I have never been able to forgive myself for being a part of the events that led to his death. The war had begun. I joined the Marion Rangers, otherwise known as the Hannibal Home Guard, on the Confederate side. You see, our family had owned slaves, so this did not seem wrong for me at the time. For 2 weeks, I was in that army. I then resigned my commission as lieutenant, as I had become incapacitated by fatigue through persistent retreating. John Briggs and I were known as the 2 best retreaters in that short-lived escapade. I have always had a dislike for killing anyone that I had not been introduced to. It was my brother Orion's turn to carry the load. An old acquaintance of his, one Edward Bates, a member of President Lincoln's first cabinet, had secured a position for Orion as the secretary of the new territory of Nevada. And the 2 of us headed for that country in an overland stage. I paid the fares, which were pretty heavy, and carrying with me what money I had been able to save, it was about $800, I would figure. And it was all in silver coin, and a good deal of a nuisance because of its weight. And we had another nuisance, an unabridged dictionary. It weighed about 1,000 pounds, and it was a ruinous expense because the stagecoach company charged for extra baggage by the ounce. We could have kept a family for a time on what that book cost us in the way of extra freight. And it wasn't a good dictionary anyway. Didn't have any modern words in it, only obsolete ones that were in use when Noah Webster was a child. My adventures on the trip and my subsequent job as the local editor of the Virginia City Enterprise could fill a book. In fact, 2 books, Roughing It, volumes 1 and 2. The job paid $40 a week. And I judged that that was about $39 more than what I was worth at the time. I'd always wanted a position which paid in the opposite proportion of value to the amount of work laid out. I was to furnish one non-perial, not sure whether it's non-perial or non-perial. It's the size of type. It's just about that big. It's between minion and, I wrote it down here, agate. It's a little type. 6 points, that's real small. That's about the size of an ant. I was to furnish one of those columns each day. I also contributed writings to the Territorial Enterprise, another newspaper, and my barbed articles about legislators' foibles gave me a need for anonymity, and that was when I created my nom de plume of Mark Twain. I got involved in a quarrel with a Mr. Laird, the editor of the Virginia Union, and the situation seemed to call for a duel. There were many duels at the time, mainly over mining claims, and a new law was hastily passed in Nevada to make it illegal to play any part in such activity, punishable by 2 years incarceration. I may have been responsible for the delivery of a challenge to a duel. A friend of the duelists heard of their danger, outrode the officers of the law, and hurried us over the border to California. There was gold and silver to be had, and my brother and I tried unsuccessfully to find it. I cared about as much for shovels as I did for weaponry. It was time for me to move on. I found a berth as a city editor of the San Francisco Morning Call, but I was not adapted to routine newspaper work and tried my hand again at prospecting. It was not my game. So, back to San Francisco. Penniless, but in line of literary promotion. My story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, had been picked up by the big papers in 1865, including the New York Sunday Press and dozens of other publications. The Sacramento Union, another newspaper, assigned me to visit the Sandwich Islands, we know it now as Hawaii, for a period of some months. And by good fortune, I had a scoop on the fire and the sinking of a clipper ship called the Hornet. I provided a clear account as told by survivors of the tragedy. They were landing in Honolulu when I arrived, and I quickly assembled the information and wrote it up and sent it on a fast packet that arrived before any other back in the States. I was rewarded by remuneration at a rate 10 times the norm. It was while I was in the Sandwich Islands that I started to wear white, because of the climate there called for wearing white, much more comfortable. And I noted that when I was wearing white, I was seldom asked to pick up anything heavy or dirty. I have favored it ever since. After 6 months in the islands, I returned to California and made my first venture on the lecture circuit. It was profitable. In 1867, I went east by way of the Isthmus, that's Panama, to Europe and the Holy Land as a correspondent of the Alta California publication. The Mediterranean, the Black Sea and environs, and the book, Innocents Abroad, resulted from the trip and sold 100,000 copies in the first year. Another passage on that voyage happened to be the brother of one Miss Olivia Langdon. This acquaintance led to the February 1870 marriage to my one and only love, my darling Livy. We were married in February of 1870. I was 35, she was younger. My first home as a man of family was in Buffalo, New York, in a house given to my bride by her father as a wedding present. I married up. I bought a 1/3 interest in a daily newspaper, the Buffalo Press, and joined its staff. But my time for jogging in harness was past. It was my last attempt at newspaper work. I was assured of a market for anything I might produce, and I could choose my own time and my own place for writing. There was a tempting literary colony in Hartford, Connecticut. The place was steeped in an atmosphere of antique peace and beauty. I had a house built there, which was one of the earliest fruits of the artistic revolt against the mid-century normalcy of domestic architecture in America. For years, it was an object of wonder to this simple-minded tourist. That house still stands to be gawked at and marveled over. The years that followed brought steady literary development. I wrote Roughing It, that was about our trip to the West, and Innocents Abroad, and The Gilded Cage, and Tom Sawyer in 1876, and its sequel, Huckleberry Finn, 9 years later, The Prince and the Pauper in 1892, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1890, Pudd'nhead Wilson in 1893 and 94. In 1873, we spent some months in England and Scotland. I lectured a few weeks in London, and there was another European journey in 1878. And the result of that was A Tramp Abroad, the result of an 18-month tour. I was never any good at investments. I financed a publishing house in New York that secured the publication of the rights to the story of the life of Ulysses S. Grant. 600,000 copies. 600,000 copies. The first check to his heirs was for $200,000, followed by another for $150,000. The largest checks ever paid at that time for a publication. Meanwhile, I was spending great sums on a typesetting machine that was too big, too complicated, and too expensive for commercial use. The publishing house business went bust, the business being terribly mishandled. I contributed $65,000 to save it, but it not only cost that, but another $96,000 to square things up. In 1896, Livy and I left with our daughter Clara on a lecturing tour around the world and wrote Following the Equator. The proceeds from that tour and book sales cleared me of all debts. My work has been translated into French, German, Russian, Italian, Swedish, Norwegian, and Magyar. Magyar? Well, that's Hungarian. The Gilded Age, all of those books. I'm going to close with a few choice quotes that have been attributed to me. And then there'll be time for questions. I will attempt to answer them. Here are some quotes. Truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it. It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress. Man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. A classic is a book which people praise but do not read. The report of my death was an exaggeration. I was gratified to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. Adam was but human. This explains it all. He did not want the apple for the apple's sake. He wanted it only because it was forbidden. One of the most striking differences between a cat and a lie is that a cat has only 9 lives. Ain't we got all the fools in town on our side? And ain't that big enough majority in any town? There ain't no way to find out why a snorer cannot hear himself snore. Training is everything. The peach was once an almond. Cauliflower is nothing but a cabbage with a college education. Now, why is it that we rejoice at birth and grieve at a funeral? It is because we are not the person involved. Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. Few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example. Be good and you will be lonesome. Clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence in society. And last but not least, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Now, I'm sure you heard about me coming in with Halley's Comet back in 1835 and going out with the same comet in 1910. It came back through, by the way, in 1986. Did anybody here remember seeing it when it came back here in 1986? You saw it? I should also point out that there are strange forces at work that we're really not in charge of. I understand Mark Twain. I understand his not worrying about where the next nickel was coming from. Something would turn up. Something will happen. Something good will happen. I don't have to worry about it. I'll start out for South America with $16 or less. It'll be all right. The idea that everything has to be mapped out and lined up and organized never occurred to Mark Twain. And it did not really occur to me either. Oh, he also said that you got to give a little credit for humans. He was born on the 7th day of the week. He was made on the last day of the week. So cut him a little slack. Well, anyway, he said that the only legalized criminals were Congress. Thank you all. that back over to you.